underground groups are not going to have some kind of advance announcement for their action. They are much more based on, tactics of surprise, and they're based on asymmetric tactics. So they tend to be small, and resistance is always kind of outgunned and outnumbered. And so to make the most of their smaller numbers, underground groups usually target places where the enemy is actually weakest or where they're the most diffuse. And they also have different goals with regard to kind of the general populace. Above ground groups often hope to mobilize citizens in general, to get broader support, to maybe build a mass movement. And they can do that, and that's often appropriate because they can use that kind of communication, and they can speak openly to people. For underground groups, that's not really the priority. Partly it's impractical because there are limits to how much they can actually communicate. I mean, there are communiques and this sort of thing, but you can't really build the social ties the same way. And also, they're really more concerned with building kind of a smaller network of trusted sympathizers who can maybe provide information or support, this sort of thing. So they want to recruit, allies, but it's not really a mass movement. So these kind of differences and principles that we've talked about can manifest in many different ways depending on the number of people involved and the size of the group and the goals of the group. And so the simplest kind of group would be a group made out of one person, an individual. And so an above ground individual here is maybe someone who kind of knows other people, but they're operating alone. And above ground, people who are working above ground alone, there's really very limited kind of leverage in terms of actual resistance. And so people who are doing that approach, often their first goal is actually to find comrades or other people they can work with, or to find a group. Underground individuals, people, this kind of bubble here represents a firewall, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Underground individuals have more options. There are famous historical kind of individual resistors like George Elser, who tried to assassinate Hitler, who was working totally alone and spent months hollowing out a hole in a column where Hitler would usually give a speech every year. And it was just by bad luck and a change of transport schedules that he wasn't able to, blow up a bomb that would have killed Hitler and stopped Nazi Germany in its tracks. But so, underground individuals can use that sort of approach. They can use sabotage. And there are ups and downs because for someone who's working alone underground, there's no one who can kind of betray them. Their identity is totally secret, but they also have no one to watch their back. Now, this slide shows underground and above ground affinity groups. Underground affinity groups usually being called cells because of compartmentalization. And these kind of groups are really the kind of the essential unit of resistance movements in general. You could call them the stem cell of resistance movements. So they form, but then they can differentiate into many different kind of approaches and many different they could optimize themselves for different strategic and tactical objectives. So an above ground affinity group is really just a small group of people who share something in common, who share political goals in common, who want to work on the same kind of projects, and who work together to that end. And we've probably all been part of different affinity groups, whether we actually called them that or whether they just kind of function that way. So an above ground affinity group has people who all know each other, of course, but they tend to be embedded in a broader social movement. So they don't just know each other. They also know, other people who are sharing their general kind of beliefs, who are part of a movement or part of a culture of resistance. And that's very different from an underground affinity group. So an underground affinity group has this firewall around them, this bubble. And that's the compartmentalization. So they know each other, but they don't have the same kind of political relationships with other people in the movement. They have that firewall to protect them. So this doesn't. If someone is underground, that doesn't mean that they're a fugitive and they're living with false ID or that sort of thing necessarily. But it does mean that the organization itself is a secret. And that's the case here. So this firewall means that people who are outside of the organization, who are outside of this group, they don't know that it exists. They don't know about it, and that it's deliberately kept secret. And so these kind of underground affinity groups are quite common in the history of resistance because they're relatively easy to form. They're kind of based on a small group of people who probably know and trust each other already. So examples would be, the Direct Action Group in Canada. This is kind of the basic model of the Earth Liberation Front, and there are countless other examples of people who've set up in this fashion. And so when we get a little bit larger, we see a little bit of change here. So above ground networks, they can still use this kind of basic framework of a bunch of people are knowing each other. So if you need to have grow beyond the practical face-to-face size of an affinity group, which is usually around 6 to 12 people, that's as many as you can kind of manage at a face-to-face meeting effectively, then that's not a problem for above ground groups because you can split into multiple overlapping affinity groups or have just a larger network or kind of a core group or all of these things. It's no problem to scale up. But underground groups, they need to do something very differently because if their single cell or if their single group gets too big, then it becomes dangerous. There are too many people who know each other. The whole group could be compromised. And so they use this compartmentalization. So they actually would split into different cells inside of one network. And so these are kind of internal firewalls here that are protecting them. So you might have one cell that the group starts off with, and then if they need more people for more actions, then they might say send one person to form another cell, or they might form a communication with kind of this other group. And the point here is that these people know each other and these people know each other, but these people don't know each other. So there's really kind of a communications bottleneck there that's designed to maintain the principle of need to know and to protect everyone involved. And this kind of underground network where there's, it's not hierarchical, there's just kind of a network that's, different cells relating to each other. This is most common for things like underground newspapers that don't really need a command structure, but they just need to spread information. Escape lines might have a non-hierarchical structure, but they would tend to have, multiple cells kind of in a string. So if someone needs to be smuggled from, Germany out into France or something like that, then there would be this chain of cells along the way that they would pass through. The above ground network, of course, is something that we've, again, I think all probably participated in. Now, the other approach for underground networks is to have a hierarchical approach. And this is essentially the paramilitary model. This is what's been used by the MK, the armed wing of the African National Congress, the original Irish Republican Army. This is the kind of basic template. And this works in the hierarchical fashion where you might have a command cell. Even the Weather Underground used something like this. They had a command cell called the Weather Bureau. And people in independent cells would then send up their suggestion for an action, and the Weather Bureau would send back down a response saying, okay, that sounds great, or that's too dangerous, or that's not in line with our political values, or this sort of thing. And the reason that underground groups organize in a hierarchical fashion is to try to overcome some of the shortcomings of limited communication when it's kind of a life and death situation, or when they need to undertake action that is very serious and that needs to happen in a coordinated way. Because if you have a bunch of cells that aren't hierarchical, that are kind of connected but very loosely and informally, if you want to get information from one cell to another, or a warning or a suggestion for an action or an order, then it might take a really long time, and it might not even be that reliable. Whereas in a hierarchical kind of system like this, there's the shortest number of links between the bottom and the top. So because, say, if these people send a message to between these two groups, historically they're not sending an email or something. They're not sending a text message, right? They might be sending a courier by foot. They might be hiding a message behind a loose brick in the wall. So this is not instantaneous. And that communication lag is really serious.